As our eyes met, his whole face collapsed. He finally recognized me. The SEAL he fired in front of the entire base, the one he humiliated, destroyed, and threw away like trash. But this time, I wasn't the broken soldier he ordered off his property. I was the superior officer he now had to answer to. Before I continue, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. What happened next shook the entire facility. He never expected to see me again, especially not with a call sign he once said I would never earn. You want to know what real pain feels like? It's not the sting of cold water during Hell Week. It's not the burn in your lungs when you're pushing your body past every limit you thought you had. Real pain, real soul-crushing, life-destroying pain is when someone you trusted, someone you served under with absolute loyalty, looks you in the eye and decides your dreams aren't worth the dirt under his boots. That's what Admiral Richardson did to me. And the rage I carry from that day, it still burns in my chest like acid every single morning I wake up. I wasn't some pampered recruit who stumbled into the Navy looking for an easy path. No. I clawed my way here from nothing. Nothing. While other kids were worried about prom dates and college applications, I was working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table for my younger siblings. My father walked out when I was 14. My mother worked herself into an early grave, trying to hold our family together. The Navy wasn't just my career choice, it was my lifeline. It was the only way a girl like me, from a broken home in a forgotten town, could build something meaningful, something honorable. I believed in that uniform with every fiber of my being. I believed in the brotherhood, the mission, the code that said if you worked hard enough, if you proved yourself worthy enough, you'd be respected for what you could do, not dismissed for what you were. God, was I naive? I threw myself into that training like my life depended on it because it did. While other recruits complained about the cold, I was grateful for a warm meal and a roof over my head. While they whined about the physical demands, I pushed harder, knowing that every pull-up, every mile run, every obstacle conquered was one step further from the poverty that nearly destroyed my family. I studied tactics until my eyes bled. I memorized protocols until I could recite them in my sleep. I volunteered for every dangerous assignment, every extra duty, every opportunity to prove I belonged. Because I loved it. I loved the precision, the discipline, the way everything had a purpose. I loved knowing that my work could save lives, could protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But most of all, I loved the idea that merit mattered. That your record spoke louder than prejudice. That honor meant something. Admiral Richardson made sure I learned how wrong I was about all of that. The first time I saw him, he commanded respect through fear. 6'3", broad shoulders, voice that could shake windows when he wanted it to. Other officers scattered when he walked into a room. Enlisted personnel would practically hold their breath until he passed. He had that kind of presence that made you stand straighter, speak clearer, work harder. But I learned something about Richardson that took me months to fully understand. There's a difference between being feared and being respected. Respect comes from competence, from caring about your people, from making decisions that serve something bigger than your own ego. Fear comes from insecurity, from knowing deep down that your authority is built on intimidation rather than earned through leadership. Richardson was terrified. Terrified that someone might see through his act. Terrified that his subordinates might realize he wasn't half the tactical mind he pretended to be. And absolutely terrified that a woman, especially one who hadn't kissed his boots for approval, might expose his weaknesses. The moment I walked into his unit, I could see it in his eyes. Not just disapproval that I expected. I'd dealt with skeptical commanding officers before. This was different. This was hatred. Pure, irrational, gut-deep hatred for what I represented. Change, challenge, the possibility that someone might measure him by his actual capabilities instead of his rank and reputation. His eyes carried a message I learned to read perfectly. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you never forget it. But I was determined to prove him wrong. I worked twice as hard as anyone else in that unit. I showed up earlier, stayed later, volunteered for assignments that others avoided. I studied his preferred tactical approaches, memorized his communication style, anticipated his needs before he voiced them. I thought if I just demonstrated my value clearly enough, professionally enough, he'd eventually recognize my contributions. That was my second mistake. The first was thinking merit mattered more than ego. The incident that sealed my fate happened during a routine mission briefing. Richardson was outlining our approach for a compound infiltration, standard reconnaissance, minimal engagement, extract intelligence, and withdraw. But as I studied the satellite imagery, something wasn't right. The approach route he'd selected took us directly through a choke point that screamed ambush risk. 2 squads would be funneled into a narrow corridor with limited cover and no alternate exit routes. I stared at those images for 10 minutes, double-checking my assessment, hoping I was wrong. But every tactical manual I'd ever studied, every simulation I'd run, every real-world scenario I'd analyzed pointed to the same conclusion. Richardson's plan would get people killed. The room was silent except for Richardson's voice as he detailed the timeline. Senior officers nodded along, accepting his strategy without question. And why wouldn't they? He was the Admiral. He'd planned dozens of successful operations. Who was I to question his judgment? But those were my brothers and sisters who'd be walking into that kill zone. People I'd trained with, shared meals with, people who trusted their leadership to bring them home safely. How could I stay silent when I knew there was a better way? My hand went up. Sir, if I may. The temperature in that room dropped 20 degrees. Richardson's eyes locked onto mine with laser focus, and I could feel every other person in that briefing room tense up. You didn't interrupt Admiral Richardson. You didn't question his tactical decisions. You certainly didn't do it as a junior officer, and you absolutely never did it as a woman in a room full of male senior staff. But I was already committed. The approach route through Sector 7, sir. I believe we're looking at significant ambush risk. The satellite intel shows elevated positions here and here. I pointed to the display, with clear sight lines into our approach corridor. If enemy forces have any advance warning, they could position themselves to pin down both squads with minimal exposure. The silence stretched for what felt like an hour. I could hear my own heartbeat. Richardson's jaw clenched, and a vein in his temple started pulsing. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but deadly quiet. Are you suggesting, Lieutenant, that my tactical assessment is inadequate? No, sir. I'm simply presenting an alternative analysis for consideration. If we modified the approach to swing wide through Sectors 9 and 11, we'd add 12 minutes to the timeline but eliminate the choke point risk entirely. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, one of Richardson's closest allies, cleared his throat. Actually, Admiral, she's not wrong. Those elevated positions are a concern. I was wondering about them myself, but didn't want to complicate the briefing. Several other officers began studying the imagery more carefully. Captain Morrison nodded slowly. The alternate route does provide better cover. Might be worth considering. And that's when I saw it. The exact moment Richardson's face changed. Not anger. I could have handled anger. This was worse. This was cold, calculating hatred. I'd done something unforgivable. I'd been right. In front of his staff. In front of officers who now questioned his judgment because a female junior officer had spotted something he'd missed. He modified the plan. Used my suggested route. The mission was a complete success. No casualties, full intelligence recovery, textbook execution. Several team members specifically mentioned how the alternate approach had likely saved lives. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt a chill of dread because I'd seen Richardson's expression when Hayes complimented the tactical adjustment. I'd humiliated him, even though that was never my intention. And men like Richardson don't forgive humiliation. That day, he made a silent vow that I wouldn't fully understand until months later. I'll break her career. The sabotage started small, subtle enough that I initially dismissed it as coincidence or standard military bureaucracy. A training assignment I'd been promised suddenly went to someone else. A specialist course I'd been recommended got mysteriously postponed indefinitely. My evaluations started including vague comments about attitude concerns and questions about team integration. When I asked for clarification, Richardson would smile that cold, professional smile and suggest I focus on improving interpersonal skills, or Work on accepting constructive feedback more gracefully. Never anything specific enough to challenge. Never anything that crossed legal lines, but a steady drip of poison that started affecting how other officers perceived me. Then he began removing me from missions I'd earned. Operations I'd helped plan, teams I'd trained with, assignments that matched my specializations perfectly. Each time, he had a reasonable explanation. We need your skills for this other project, or command thinks you'd be more valuable in a support role for this one, or my personal favorite, we're concerned about unit cohesion and think it's best if you sit this one out. Unit cohesion. As if my presence somehow damaged team effectiveness. As if the woman who'd scored highest in tactical assessment and had 0 disciplinary infractions was somehow a disruptive influence that endangered mission success. But the most devastating part wasn't being excluded from operations. It was watching other officers distance themselves from me. People I'd considered friends started avoiding casual conversation. Colleagues stopped inviting me to informal gatherings. Even some of the enlisted personnel I'd worked closely with began treating me with polite but cold professionalism. Richardson had poisoned the well. I know that now. He'd had conversations with key personnel, planted seeds of doubt about my stability, my reliability, my commitment to the mission. Nothing actionable, nothing I could prove, just careful whispers that made people question whether associating with me might hurt their own careers. The evaluations got worse. Difficulty accepting authority. Questionable judgment under stress. Concerns about mental stability and team integration. All subjective assessments that couldn't be easily challenged, but devastating when viewed collectively. My service record was being systematically destroyed by a man whose ego I'd accidentally bruised during a tactical briefing. I tried everything. I requested meetings with Richardson to address the evaluation concerns directly. He was always too busy or suggested we discuss it later. I attempted to transfer to a different unit. My requests were either denied or disappeared into administrative limbo. I even considered filing a formal complaint, but what would I allege? That my commanding officer was giving me poor evaluations? That I felt excluded from certain operations? Without concrete evidence of discrimination or abuse, I'd look like a disgruntled officer making excuses for poor performance. Meanwhile, every day became a silent battlefield. Walking into briefings where conversations stopped when I entered. Sitting alone in the mess hall while people I'd once laughed with found reasons to eat elsewhere. Completing menial assignments that had nothing to do with my training or capabilities, designed specifically to waste my skills and crush my morale. I started questioning everything. Maybe I really was problematic. Maybe my tactical suggestion during that briefing had been insubordination rather than professional input. Maybe I didn't belong in this unit, in this service, in this career I'd sacrificed everything to build. Richardson watched it all with satisfaction. I could see it in his eyes during staff meetings, the cold pleasure of watching me slowly break. He'd assign me to equipment maintenance, supply inventory, administrative tasks that any clerk could handle. He was systematically erasing my value, my purpose, my identity as a warrior. But he wasn't finished yet. He needed a finale, a public demonstration that would ensure I never found my footing anywhere else in the Navy. He needed to destroy me so completely, so publicly, that no other commanding officer would risk taking on damaged goods. The formation was routine, monthly personnel review, standard announcements, typical administrative business. 300 personnel standing at attention while Richardson reviewed unit status and operational updates. I was in the back row, barely visible, which had become my usual position over the past several months. Richardson was discussing recent commendations when he paused mid-sentence. His eyes found mine across the formation, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. Anticipation. This wasn't routine. This was planned. This was my execution. Before we conclude, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly area, I need to address a personnel matter that affects unit integrity. My heart started hammering. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not like this. Lieutenant, he called out, using my name like a curse word. Front and center. The walk to the front of that formation felt like a death march. 300 pairs of eyes watching as I approached the man who'd systematically destroyed my career. Some faces showed confusion, others sympathy. A few displayed the uncomfortable fascination people have when witnessing a car accident. I stopped in front of Richardson and came to attention. "Sir." "Lieutenant," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "your performance in this unit has been consistently substandard. Your attitude has been disruptive to team cohesion. Your judgment has proven unreliable under operational conditions." Each word hit like a physical blow. Lies. All lies. But presented with such authority, such conviction, that they took on the weight of truth. Furthermore, he continued, his voice rising, "Recent psychological evaluations indicate you may not be mentally fit for continued service in special operations." Psychological evaluations? What's psychological evaluations? I'd never been referred for mental health assessment. This was complete fabrication, but who would challenge an admiral's word in front of the entire unit? The formation stood frozen in absolute silence. Some officers stared straight ahead, unwilling to witness what was happening. Others watched with horrified fascination. A few female personnel in the back rows had tears in their eyes. Richardson stepped closer, close enough that I could see the triumph in his eyes. This was the moment he'd been building toward for months. The complete and total destruction of everything I'd worked to build. "Turn in your operational badge," he ordered. "You're done here." My hands were shaking as I reached for my uniform. The badge, the symbol of everything I'd sacrificed to earn, everything I'd endured to deserve. Years of training, months of qualification, countless hours of study and preparation. My identity, my purpose, my proof that I belonged. I fumbled with the clasp, my fingers not responding properly. Richardson watched with cold patience, savoring every second of my humiliation. When I finally managed to remove the badge, I held it out with a hand that trembled like a leaf in a storm. He took it without ceremony and dropped it into his pocket like garbage. Then he grabbed my uniform jacket and physically tore off my unit patch. Ripped it right off my chest in front of 300 people, the fabric making a harsh tearing sound that echoed across the silent formation. "Get off my base," he said quietly, but his voice carried in the stillness. "Now." I don't remember walking away. I don't remember leaving the formation area or crossing the base perimeter. My mind had gone blank, shut down to protect itself from processing the full scope of what had just happened. When awareness returned, I was sitting in my car in an empty parking lot 5 miles from the base, staring at the torn fabric where my patch had been. That's when the tears came. Not gentle, crying, violent, body-shaking sobs that felt like they might tear me apart from the inside. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd believed in, everything I'd sacrificed to achieve had been taken from me in less than 5 minutes. Publicly. Humiliatingly. Without appeal or recourse. Richardson had won. He'd eliminated the threat to his authority and sent a clear message to anyone else who might challenge his decisions. This is what happens when you forget your place. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that destroying me publicly like that didn't break my spirit. It crystallized it. It burned away everything weak and uncertain about my character and left behind something harder, something more focused, something absolutely committed to proving that his assessment of my worth was the greatest tactical error of his career. Sitting in that parking lot, uniform torn, career destroyed, future uncertain, I made a promise that would sustain me through the darkest months ahead. "You will regret underestimating me." The weeks that followed were the lowest point in my life. Depression hit like a physical weight, making it difficult to get out of bed, to eat, to function in any meaningful way. The shame was suffocating, not just from the public humiliation, but from the doubt Richardson had planted about my own competence. Maybe I really was unstable. Maybe I really didn't belong. Maybe he'd seen something in me that I'd been too blind or arrogant to recognize. I isolated myself completely. Couldn't bear to face friends who might ask what happened, couldn't handle the sympathy or the pity or the awkward attempts to make me feel better. I'd lost more than a job. I'd lost my identity, my purpose, my entire sense of who I was supposed to be in this world. But isolation, it turns out, can be useful. When you're completely alone with your thoughts, when there's no external noise or distraction, you eventually run out of ways to lie to yourself. And the truth I finally confronted, after weeks of self-pity and doubt, was simple. Richardson had destroyed my position, but he hadn't destroyed me. My skills were still intact. My training was still valid. My intelligence and tactical abilities hadn't evaporated just because one insecure man had decided I was a threat to his authority. I started researching alternative paths. Elite qualification programs that operated outside traditional Navy command structures. Special operations units that recruited based on capability rather than politics. Programs so demanding, so exclusive, that successfully completing them would establish credentials no one could question or dismiss. The program I found was classified, invitation only, and absolutely brutal. It made SEAL training look like summer camp. Candidates were recruited from across all military branches based on exceptional performance records and psychological profiles that indicated extreme resilience under stress. The qualification process was designed to break people, physically, mentally, emotionally. Most candidates didn't last a week. The physical demands were beyond anything I'd experienced. Months of training in conditions designed to simulate the worst possible operational environments. Arctic water survival that left candidates with hypothermia and frostbite. Desert endurance tests where people collapsed from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Urban warfare scenarios where split-second decisions determined whether you lived or died. But the mental warfare was worse. Psychological stress techniques designed to shatter confidence and reveal character flaws. Sleep deprivation experiments that pushed candidates to the edge of hallucination. Interrogation simulations that made strong people beg for mercy. Every morning, I woke up and repeated the same sentence: "You will regret underestimating me." When the ice water felt like it was stopping my heart, when the desert heat made me question my sanity, when the instructors screamed that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, that I should quit while I still had some dignity left, I thought about Richardson's face as he tore my patch off. I thought about the satisfaction in his eyes as he destroyed my career. And I kept going. Candidates dropped out daily. Strong, experienced operators who'd served with distinction in multiple theaters decided they'd had enough. The program had a 90% failure rate, and the instructors made sure everyone knew it. They wanted us to quit. They needed us to understand that this level of training was reserved for people who could endure anything, sacrifice anything, overcome anything to complete the mission. I finished in the top 3% of my class. The call sign I earned wasn't just a designation. It was recognition of a specific type of operational excellence. The kind reserved for individuals who could function effectively in any environment, under any conditions, with any available resources. It marked someone who could be trusted with the most sensitive, most dangerous, most critical operations that traditional units couldn't handle. More importantly, it was a call sign Richardson had once told me I would never be worthy of earning. He'd used it as an example of the kind of elite designation that was reserved for real warriors, rather than people who didn't understand their place in the hierarchy. Wearing that call sign for the first time felt like resurrection. The tactical unit that recruited me operated at levels I'd never imagined during my regular Navy service. These weren't routine operations, they were surgical strikes that required absolute precision and perfect execution. The kind of missions where failure meant international incidents or loss of strategic advantage. The kind of work that shaped global outcomes rather than just completing assigned objectives. My team leaders weren't politicians or administrators. They were operators who evaluated people based on results rather than politics. They cared about tactical innovation, strategic thinking, adaptability under pressure. Everything I'd always believed military service should value, everything Richardson's ego had prevented him from recognizing. I excelled. Not just performed adequately, I thrived in ways that surprised even me. The tactical skills I developed, combined with the mental resilience forged during qualification, made me exceptionally effective in high-stakes environments. I started receiving commendations from command levels that Richardson would never reach. I was assigned to operations that required security clearances he'd never been granted access to. But the real transformation began when I started developing my own tactical approaches. Years of studying other people's strategies, of being told to follow established protocols, had given me a deep understanding of conventional methods and their limitations. Now I had the freedom and authority to experiment with alternative approaches. The logistics and security company grew out of that innovation. What started as consultation work for former colleagues became a full business providing specialized services that traditional military contractors couldn't match. We offered tactical analysis, security planning, logistics coordination for operations that required absolute discretion and perfect execution. The company succeeded because it was built on merit rather than politics. We hired the best people regardless of their background, gender, or previous service difficulties. We evaluated contracts based on strategic value rather than bureaucratic convenience. We delivered results that exceeded client expectations because our people were motivated by professional excellence rather than career advancement through institutional channels. Within 3 years, we had contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Within 5 years, we were consulted on operations that affected national security policy. The woman Richardson had dismissed as mentally unstable and unfit for service had built something more influential than anything he'd achieved in his entire career. But success wasn't enough. Professional achievement felt hollow without the validation of showing Richardson exactly how wrong his assessment had been. I needed him to see what he'd thrown away. I needed him to understand the magnitude of his error. I needed him to face the consequences of letting ego override judgment. The opportunity came when our company partnered with a defense logistics facility that needed security consultation for classified material handling. Standard contract work, but it required on-site assessment to understand their current protocols and identify improvement opportunities. I was reviewing security footage with the facility manager when he mentioned they'd recently hired several new personnel. Good to have experienced people, especially the former military folks. Had an admiral start last week. Driving trucks now, but good to have someone who understands operational discipline. An admiral driving trucks? That was unusual enough to catch my attention, but I didn't think much of it until he pointed to a figure visible on one of the security monitors. Something about the posture, the way he carried himself, felt familiar. "What's his name?" I asked, though I was already suspecting the answer. "Richardson. Earl Richardson. Says he spent 25 years in the Navy before retiring." Retiring? That's what he was calling it. The truth, which I learned through discreet inquiries, was significantly different. Richardson's career had ended badly. Several officers had filed formal complaints about his leadership methods. An investigation into unit morale had revealed a pattern of abusive behavior toward personnel he perceived as threats to his authority. The final incident involved allegations of falsifying psychological evaluations to justify dismissing a female officer. The Navy had given him a choice: face court-martial proceedings that would destroy his reputation and eliminate his pension, or accept early retirement with a clean record. He'd chosen retirement, but the settlement terms included restrictions that prevented him from obtaining equivalent civilian positions. No defense contracting company would risk hiring someone whose military service had ended under investigation. So Admiral Richardson, who'd once commanded hundreds of personnel and controlled multi-million-dollar operations, was now driving supply trucks for $18 an hour. The man who destroyed careers based on ego was working paycheck to paycheck in a job that required no special skills or authority. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt empty. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined. This was just a bitter, diminished man paying the consequences of his own character flaws. Richardson had destroyed himself more thoroughly than I ever could have. But fate, it seems, had one more scene to play. I was conducting my final security assessment when the facility manager asked if I'd mind speaking with the new drivers about cargo handling protocols. Most of them understand the basics, but having someone with your background explain the security requirements might be helpful. The meeting was scheduled for a routine conference room briefing. Nothing dramatic, just a straightforward discussion of classified material procedures with a group of new employees. I walked in expecting to see a dozen truck drivers taking notes about shipping regulations. Richardson was sitting in the back row. He looked up from his notebook as I entered the room, and our eyes met for the first time in 7 years. The recognition was immediate, and the impact on his face was devastating. All color drained from his features. His mouth opened slightly, then closed without sound. His hands started trembling. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The other drivers sensed something but couldn't understand what. Richardson stared at my uniform, at my rank insignia, at the call sign patch he'd once told me I would never earn. And in that instant, he realized everything. I hadn't just survived his attempt to destroy my career, I had transcended it. I had built something beyond his ability to touch or influence. I had achieved recognition that made his former rank look insignificant. The woman he'd dismissed as unfit for service now outranked him everywhere that mattered. The person he'd humiliated in front of hundreds of personnel was now in a position to determine his employment future. The career he'd tried to end had resulted in success that dwarfed anything he'd accomplished. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and professional. Good morning, everyone. I'm here to discuss security protocols for classified material handling. Richardson's response was barely a whisper. Ma'am. The word hung in the air like an acknowledgement of everything that had changed between us. The feared admiral who'd once destroyed careers was addressing me with the deference required by rank and position. The man who'd claimed I didn't understand hierarchy was now learning exactly where he stood in the new order. Throughout the briefing, Richardson sat in absolute silence. He didn't ask questions, didn't take notes, didn't participate in the discussion. He simply stared at the table in front of him, occasionally glancing up with an expression of complete defeat. When the meeting ended, the other drivers filed out discussing the new procedures. Richardson remained seated, apparently unable or unwilling to move. I gathered my materials slowly, giving him time to process what had happened. Finally, he stood and approached my position at the front of the room. His movement was hesitant, uncertain, like someone approaching a dangerous animal. Lieutenant. Ma'am, he began, his voice cracking slightly. I looked at him directly. Yes, driver. The title hit him like a physical blow. Driver. Not admiral, not sir, not any acknowledgement of his former status or authority. Just his current job description, spoken with the same cold professionalism he'd once used to dismiss my value. He tried again. What I did to you back then? I held up a hand to stop him. You were protecting what you thought was important to you. I understand. But I didn't let him off easily. I continued. You saw someone whose success might highlight your inadequacies, and you chose to eliminate the threat rather than address the weakness. It was a tactical decision based on personal interest rather than unit effectiveness. Richardson's face crumpled. This wasn't forgiveness. This was analysis. Cold, accurate, devastating analysis of his motivations and character. The irony, I continued, is that everything you feared about me was accurate. I was more tactically innovative than you. I did earn recognition that exceeded yours. I have built something more significant than anything you accomplished. Your assessment was correct. Your response to that assessment destroyed your career. He stood there absorbing the impact of those words. Everything he'd suspected about me, everything that had triggered his need to eliminate me, had proven true. He'd been right to see me as a threat to his position. He'd been catastrophically wrong about how to handle that threat. I could have learned from you, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Instead, I tried to destroy you. Yes, I agreed. You could have been part of something innovative and successful. Instead, you chose to protect your ego. That choice led directly to where you are now. The silence stretched between us. Richardson appeared to be struggling with something, shame, regret, the full weight of understanding how his own character flaws had orchestrated his downfall. When I walked away from that conversation, I felt something I hadn't expected, pity. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not the triumph I'd imagined for years. Just sadness for a man who'd had every opportunity to be better than he chose to be. Richardson had fallen farther than I'd ever risen. I'd built my success on merit, innovation, and professional excellence. His destruction had come from within, from insecurities and character weaknesses that eventually consumed everything he'd worked to achieve. I didn't humiliate him further. I didn't report his past behavior to facility management. I didn't use my position to make his new job more difficult. I simply did what he'd never been capable of doing. I focused on the mission rather than personal vendetta. But as I walked out of that facility, wearing the call sign he'd said I would never earn, carrying the authority he'd tried to destroy, leading the kind of life he'd attempted to prevent, I felt complete in a way I'd never experienced before. Not because I'd defeated him, he'd defeated himself, but because I'd proven something important about resilience, about character, about the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent damage. Richardson had knocked me down, but he hadn't been able to keep me there. He'd broken my position, but not my potential. The most important lesson from this entire experience isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about understanding that your response to injustice defines your character more than the injustice itself. Richardson chose to abuse his authority when he felt threatened. I chose to build something better when that abuse tried to destroy me. Never underestimate a quiet fighter. The person you break today may become the person you salute tomorrow. But more than that, never underestimate the power of merit over politics, substance over appearance, character over authority. The people who try to destroy others to protect their own inadequacies always eventually face the consequences of that choice. Richardson learned that lesson 7 years too late. By then, the woman he dismissed as unfit for service had become the superior officer he now had to answer to. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe, and comment your country. More powerful stories about overcoming injustice and building something meaningful from the ashes of defeat are coming. Remember, your current situation is not your final destination. The people who underestimate you today may be looking up to you tomorrow. Use their doubt as fuel. Use their dismissal as motivation. Use their attempts to break you as the foundation for building something they could never destroy.